Sarah. I'm the librarian at the Ashurbanipal Library of the Assyrian Cultural Foundation. Thank you for joining us for the third lecture in our Nabu Circle Lecture Series presentation entitled Rediscovering Assyria. I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Valk. He will be talking about the Assyrians and Arameans in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Dr. Valk earned his PhD from New York University and is currently a docent in Ancient Near Eastern Studies and a university researcher at the University of Helsinki's Center of Excellence in Ancient Near Eastern Empires. Formerly a lecturer in Assyriology at Leiden University, he specializes in Assyrian history in the 1st and 2nd millennia BC, focusing on the intersection of cuneiform and West Semitic traditions. His broader interests include social history, state formation, and the application of social science methods to ancient evidence. Author of the forthcoming book, Ancient Assyrians, Rethinking Identity and Society in Antiquity and Beyond, Dr. Valk is currently researching the transition from Sumero-Akkadian to Aramaic in the 1st millennium BC. In 2025, he will lead the European Research Council-funded Aramization project at the Spanish National Research Council. Today's lecture will explore the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which spanned from Egypt to Iran and encompassed a diverse array of peoples. Among them, the Arameans are frequently mentioned in ancient Assyrian sources, but who were they? It is tempting to interpret Arameans through the prism of the familiar, as a putative people with its own land and language that can be opposed to an Assyrian counterpart. A closer study of the sources, however, suggests that this was not the case. Assyrian texts distinguish Arameans based on their relationship with the Agrarian Assyrian state rather than based on other criteria. Making sense of the Assyrian conception of Arameans can also help us make sense of how Assyrians viewed themselves. Assyrians and Arameans were not so much two distinct peoples, but represented instead two different forms of social organization at the frontier between barbarism and civilization. After the lecture, we invite you to stay updated on the latest news and events of the Assyrian Cultural Foundation by following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I'll provide you with the links to all our social media platforms in the chat shortly. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Robert DeKelaita to share some words about today's lecture. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome Dr. Jonathan Valk, and welcome everyone here. I just want to say how excited we are to hear this lecture. This topic is near and dear to many of us, modern Assyrians, because there is a slight debate within our circles as to this issue, and we find this topic very interesting as well as complicated. So with that, Dr. Valk, you asked if you could talk for a while. Please do. And if you don't mind beginning with, tell us what interested you first in this topic, just briefly, and then please go into your lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah and Robert, for the introduction, and the Assyrian Cultural Foundation for the invitation. Robert, you asked what interested me in the subject of Assyrian and Aramean identities in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This interest comes essentially from a broader research line, research direction in how ancient peoples thought about themselves and the world that they lived in. And what I find when I look at ancient sources is that the way that people relate to each other often doesn't overlap very cleanly with the way that we think today that groups, nations cohere, form, and reproduce themselves. So the sorts of notions about ethnicity and nation that we so often take for granted don't easily translate into the past. And I think that's very much the case when we start to look at Assyrians and Arameans, as we will do today in the period of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, in this talk that I titled Between Barbarism and Civilization. And obviously, these are two very loaded terms, and I don't use them in a judgmental way, but simply as a viewpoint that arises from the sources that we will be looking at today, which is the sources that are produced in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And these terms, as I hope to show you, are very much the sorts of categories that the people in question were themselves working with when they were thinking about Assyrians and Arameans. So to orient us, let's look at the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Here it is on a map. So what we can see is that at its height, the Neo-Assyrian Empire essentially extended throughout the ancient Near East, from Iran to Egypt, from Anatolia to the Arabian Desert. And in this very broad geographical expanse, of course, there was a great deal of human diversity, people speaking different languages, people living in different sorts of life, subsisting through different means, practicing different cultures. And all of this human diversity was incorporated into one state framework. Now, this state framework is one in which we also find, of course, Assyrians and Arameans. And our question, the one that we'll be trying to answer today, is where Assyrians and Arameans fit in. And to be able to answer this question, we'll need to look at two different questions. First, as they will help us make sense of the evidence. One is, what is civilization and who is part of it? And two, what is barbarism and who is part of that? So let's start with civilization. Here is a very nice picture of the town of Hasan Keyf in the Upper Tigris region, today in modern Turkey. Unfortunately, this site has been flooded because of the construction of a dam in recent years. So you can no longer visit it, and it no longer looks like this. But in any case, one of the things that it shows us very nicely is the foundation of pre-modern agrarian economies. What is a pre-modern agrarian economy? Essentially, in the past, people were very much dependent on the food that they were able to produce themselves. Today, that is still the case, but we have become completely divorced from the production processes of food, and all of the added economic value in our system comes from different sectors. That was not true in pre-modern economies. In pre-modern economies, fundamentally, the sources of value were the ability to turn land into agricultural produce, to generate surpluses, and to grow on the basis of these surpluses and to invest these surpluses in different directions. So the fundamentals of wealth in these sorts of societies were agricultural produce, and of course, having access or controlling large groups of people who were able to work the land to generate that produce. And what we see in this nice landscape from Hasan Keyf is precisely that model, where you find the source of water that allows people to turn the land next to the source of water into productive farmland. And then beyond that, there is land that is unproductive and not part of the agrarian system, at least not directly in the same way that the farmland is. Assyria, as a great empire, was interested in increasing its resource base. So one of the things that we see in the Neo-Assyrian Empire is that the Assyrian heartland, the so-called Assyrian Triangle, which you can see on the map here, experienced an enormous boom in settlement, both in terms of the extensification of that settlement. That means that more and more land was brought under cultivation. Land that formerly was not used for farming was brought under cultivation. And also there were simply many, many more people present there, and the land was worked much more intensively. So archaeological surveys have demonstrated that the Neo-Assyrian period was the period of most dense settlement throughout the Assyrian Triangle until essentially the early modern period. So there was, even though it is 3,000 years ago, this was the high point until the modern period of settlement in this area. The extent of the increase of the population growth is not explainable simply with reference to natural population growth. Even if everybody was at peace and having as many children as they could, there's no way that they could have caused this massive increase in settlement in this area. One of the ways that we know that Assyria managed to attract people was not simply through voluntary immigration, but also through the practice of mass deportation. This is a policy that the Assyrian Empire is especially famous for, though it is not unique by any means to the Assyrian Empire. In this process, basically people from conquered lands who, for whatever reason, had run afoul of the Assyrian authorities, found themselves forcibly displaced and brought to different places the overwhelming majority of them were resettled in the Assyrian Triangle, and this accounts for a large part of the exceptional growth in population that we find there in the Neo-Assyrian period. Estimates of the number of deportees range from about 1.5 million to 4.5 million. So these are really large numbers, even in today's terms, let alone in the situation that was current in the first millennium BCE. So all of these people were brought in fundamentally to increase the wealth and resource base of what was fundamentally a farming empire, an empire that consisted of people working the land and extracting their wealth through that work. One of the major projects that was undertaken in Neo-Assyrian times was this huge irrigation project, primarily under the reign of Sennacherib, in which the waters from the hilly land near to Nineveh were redirected and brought into Nineveh itself. This process is described in a famous inscription of Sennacherib's, the Bavian inscription, in which he is recorded as saying, "At that time, I greatly enlarged the site of Nineveh. I had its inner wall and its outer wall, which had never been constructed before, built anew, and I raised them as high as mountains. Its fields, which had been turned into wastelands due to lack of water, were woven over with spider webs. Moreover, its people did not know artificial irrigation, but had their eyes turned for rain and showers from the sky. I climbed high, and I had 18 canals dug from various places, and I directed their courses into the Khusur River. This is the river that runs through Nineveh before joining up with the Tigris nearby." So we can see that Sennacherib is investing a great deal of resources simply to do what we were explaining in the previous slide, to intensify or enable the intensification of agricultural production in the region of Nineveh. The scale of this project is really colossal. We see here a map produced by the Land of Nineveh Archaeological Project, which documents these works. And the red lines are essentially the canal system that was built up during the reign of Sennacherib to redirect water through the Khusur River, through Nineveh, for use for agricultural purposes and other purposes. So the scale is not only immense, but also what it enabled is immense. It enabled great new swaths of land to be brought under productive agricultural labor, so that the resource base increased, so that there was scope for more people to come into the area and for the wealth of the state to grow. And this was such an achievement that it was also celebrated with all sorts of monuments. So on the left here, we see one of the monuments that exists in one of the headwaters of this canal system in the area of Jerwan or Khinis or Bavian. We have more of these monumental sites throughout the headwaters of this canal system. So at the top left, there's a relief of the procession of the gods at Faida. There's a similar one at Bavian. There's also this colossal Lamassu that now has fallen into the water. And here we have a reconstruction of the centerpiece of the system, the Jerwan Canal, as it would have looked in its heyday. And even today, if you go there, you can still see many of the stones that were used to build it up, which are in the picture there. The point of all of this was not only to enrich Nineveh and to allow the king to build up his pleasure palaces and all of these parks and exotic orchards that he developed, but fundamentally, and I'll skip through most of the text here to get to the point, the reason that all of this is undertaken is to provide irrigation annually for the cultivation of grain and sesame. So although they're also using this water for all sorts of other purposes, the fundamental purpose here is to increase the agrarian base of the Assyrian state, and by increasing its productive capacity, to increase its ability to project its power over the empire, to provide the surpluses that can feed the armies that are necessary to maintain the empire, to conquer new lands, and to project the will of the Assyrian state abroad. So when we look at this agrarian civilization, we can ask, so who are the people that are running this thing? Who are the people that are participating in this project? So fundamentally, When we look at the royal inscriptions, we see that they refer to all of the people of the empire indiscriminately as Assyrian. Although there are these vast populations of deported people from different backgrounds that are part of the society that are moved there, we don't see any references to them as being in any way fundamentally different from the people who are already living there. All of these people are, from the point of view of the state's inscriptions, Assyrian. There's no qualification, this kind of Assyrian, that kind of Assyrian. They're all indiscriminately Assyrian. And this is a process that is very consciously driven. One of the things that we see when we look at references to Assyrians in the royal inscriptions is that they often appear in moments when we have these new populations being brought to Assyria and being integrated into the rest of the population. So if we look at the royal inscriptions of Tiglath-Pileser III, we'll find many references like these two here, where a population of deportees that is brought into the heartland. The following is said of them. I made them of one mouth, that's the literal translation, but we can also translate it as imposed a single authority over them or united them. I counted them among the people of Assyria, and I imposed on them the yoke of the god Ashur, my lord, as on Assyrians. Another example, I settled 555 captive highlanders of the city Bit Sangibuti in the city Til Karme. I counted them among the people of Assyria and imposed upon them corvée labor as on Assyrians. So this is a very self-conscious process whereby people that are brought to Assyria are viewed by the state just like the other Assyrians are. They are counted among the other Assyrians. They are integrated into this system, and they're given the same obligations as the rest of the Assyrians. So they are fundamentally given plots of land to farm or given crafts to practice. They're integrated into this economic system fundamentally as equals, but from the bottom up, of course. This view is maybe best expressed in what the scholar Mario Liverani has called Sargon II's Manifesto of Assyrian Imperialism. In English, we can view it here, where Sargon, or in Sargon's name, is written, "People of the four quarters of the world, that is, a foreign tongue and inharmonious speech, inhabitants of mountain and plain, as many as were shepherded by the light of the gods, the Lord of all, whom I carried off with the power of my scepter by the command of the god Ashur, my lord. I made them of one mouth, imposed a single authority over them, and I settled them in Dur Sharukin, that was Sargon's newly built capital. I appointed Assyrians over them, knowledgeable in every craft, as overseers and supervisors for instruction in work and in revering God and King." So the basic idea that this passage conveys is that the role of Assyrian Empire, of the Assyrian state, is to bring together all of these people into this one world system, at the head of which, of course, stands the supreme god Ashur, whose representative on earth is the Assyrian king. And all of these people from all of these different kinds of lands, with all of these different backgrounds and languages, are united under this system, where the people who are already part of the system, the Assyrians, are essentially used as instructors to teach them how to become a part of that system in their own right. So to learn how to work productively, to engage in crafts, to engage in farming, and to become part of this state project in their own right, and as we have seen, fundamentally to end up as Assyrians themselves. That's not to say that they didn't recognize that there was difference. Of course, Assyrian sources are sensitive to the fact that people are different, they come from different places, have different backgrounds. We've already seen this expression of a recognition of linguistic difference in this text from Sargon, where he speaks of the people of foreign tongue and inharmonious speech. There's another more practical text, not from the royal inscriptions, but a letter from an official to an Assyrian king, in which he reports that there are many foreign language speakers in Nippur under the aegis of the king, my lord. I implement the king's orders and speak to them. So people were aware that people were different, but there is no differentiation of people based on the fact that they are different or that they speak different languages. They're all part of the system. It's not like one group is treated this way and one group is treated that way simply because they speak different languages or have different backgrounds. We see this recognition of difference also in the famous Assyrian reliefs. So there are many reliefs that depict the conquest of people from all across the ancient Middle East. Here are 4 examples. And what we can see is that systematically, people from different places are depicted quite differently. They are recognizably different people with different sorts of clothes that they wear, with even different physiognomy to some extent, different hairstyles. So we can see on the left Nubian captives from a campaign in Egypt. on the bottom right, we can see Arabs from the Arabian desert with the camels, with a simpler sort of clothing. We can also see different groups from elsewhere in the Levant and the Aegean, also with characteristic clothes, characteristic hairstyles. So they're aware that people look different. When it comes to how Assyrians themselves are supposed to look, there is also in the reliefs a very distinct look for what an Assyrian should wear and how he should carry his hair and what the general appearance should be. And that's what we can see here. So the characteristics of how Assyrians are depicted in reliefs are this tunic that reaches to just above the knee. Sometimes they have these tights and boots, but not always. The hairstyle comes down to about shoulders, and it has these curls at the bottom. There's the belt at the waist. In this scene, we see quite a few unbearded people, but in general, most men by default are depicted with a beard. And we can see this same style in what is a fairly typical relief here, depicting all sorts of Assyrians hard at work in the construction of one of the palaces of Sennacherib. They're transporting one of these colossal stone lamassus to be installed in the palace. And you see all of these rows of workers, and they are fundamentally identical in outward appearance and style. If we zoom in, it becomes clearer that we see these rows of workers where we can see the characteristic Assyrian tunic to just above the knee with the belt, the same hairstyle, and in this case, all beards. If we look a little bit more closely, we'll see that one of the rows of workers is different than the others, and that's this one. Here, when we notice two fundamental differences, maybe even three, but the major ones are the fact that these ones have headwear, whereas Assyrians never really have headwear when they're at work. They do if they're in the army, but that's a different context. And another thing that you might notice is that if you look between their legs, there is a piece of fabric there. These tunics are not above the knee tunics like the Assyrian ones. These would have been full-length tunics that when people are working or moving around, they tie up to above the knee, and the excess cloth then hangs there. And that's what's being depicted. This is what in the Bible is called girding one's loins. So you have a full-length tunic and you tie it up so that you can move more freely. What's interesting about these row of workers that is clearly different from the rest of the Assyrians is that there's another relief from roughly the same time, also under Sennacherib, where we see again a group of workers. The bottom row and the top row conform to what we expect for how Assyrians should look, with in this case also the boots and the tights for some of them, but not all of them. But then again, the middle row has precisely the same outfit as we see in this other row of workers. That is this headwear, and also this tunic with the girded loin, that is the excess cloth hanging there as well. Now, it's a bit curious that amidst all of these depictions of Assyrians, where they all look pretty much exactly the same, in this very narrow period of time under Sennacherib, there are two reliefs where among the workers we have two lines of workers that have this clearly different outward look. They wear different clothes and they style themselves differently. One of the things that's interesting is that also under Sennacherib, one of his major campaigns was against Judah. And in this campaign, he reports in his inscriptions that he deported more than 200,000 people from Judah. This number is probably not historically accurate. There are various explanations, but the important takeaway is that it's clear that this was an exceptionally important campaign for him, with an exceptionally large number of deportees. The scene that you are looking at here is one of the reliefs that is depicting the fall of the city of Lachish, one of the strongholds in Judah, and the resulting deportation of people from that city. And if we look closely in the back, we'll find that there are men, and these are not the only ones, but here they're very clearly, that are dressed in exactly this way that we see in the reliefs that we looked at of workers in Assyria. They have this tunic with the excess cloth dangling. They have that very same hat. So the visual description of these people that we see in this relief matches perfectly with that one that we see of these workers. So what seems to be the case is that because all of these reliefs are from roughly the same time, and there was such a large amount of deportees from Judah, the people who drew up these reliefs showing all of these Assyrians working together also included lines of workers that conformed to what they imagined Judahites looked like. So when we see these lines of workers, we see both old Assyrians, those who already lived there, and new Assyrians, people recently deported there, working side by side. And as we've seen in these reliefs, there's no differentiation in terms of the work that they're doing, the treatment that they're receiving. These are old and new Assyrians working equally as part of this system, this Assyrian state system, to build this infrastructure, these palaces, and all of these monuments that the kings are interested in building. And of course, this is the only moment in which we see people in Assyria that have a different aesthetic look. In all subsequent reliefs, there are no further people that look like this. They fundamentally become just like the other Assyrians. There's just this brief moment, for whatever reason, they decided to depict at least one of the rows of workers with these other characteristics. Presumably it's because of the vast influx of Judahites at that time. Another place that we see that there is this coming together of different people as Assyrians is in the onomasticon. The onomasticon is a fancy way of saying the record of all of the names of people that we have from this period. So if we look at the names of people in Assyrian society, in the Neo-Assyrian sources, and we have very, very many of them, thousands in fact, we see that there are names with all sorts of different linguistic backgrounds. There are Assyrian names in Akkadian, there are Babylonian names, there are Aramaic names, there are Hebrew names, Phoenician names, Elamite names, Hittite names, names from languages that we don't even know yet, and not only the names, but also some of the elements in the names. So there are gods that come from all over this vast landscape. So we clearly see different people participating in the society as reflected in their names. One of the interesting things is that there is no correlation between having a name of a particular background and your rank in the society. So we see people with names that suggest non-Assyrian backgrounds occupying very prominent positions. And we see people with Assyrian names occupying very lowly positions, including slaves. We also see people with Assyrian names giving birth to children who don't have Assyrian names, and people who don't have Assyrian names giving birth to children with Assyrian names. So it really looks like a bit of a melting pot simply on the basis of the names. We can look at one case study. So that's the name Arbayu. Arbayu is a so-called gentilic name. That's a name that simply refers to the group that somebody belongs to. So his name simply means the Arab. There are at least 12 individuals in the Neo-Assyrian sources who have this name. That is, they're simply called the Arab. And if we look at what roles they occupy in society, we see again that there is no restriction of place. There's no correlation between having a name being called the Arab and your level of participation in the society. We have mayors of the major cities, Kalchu and Ashur, who are called the Arab. There's a provincial governor called the Arab. There are military officers called the Arab. The father of one of the priests in the temple of Ashur is called the Arab. So clearly the fact that these people have some sort of a association with an Arab identity doesn't stop them in any way, shape, or form, both from participating in the project of Assyrian Empire and in adopting what we can assume is at some level an Assyrian identity. Perhaps the clearest expression of this inclusive view of Assyrianness comes from a text that we can, or that has been called Esarhaddon Succession Treaty. There are many passages in this text that point to this. This text comes from a very narrow political window. So Esarhaddon's father, Sennacherib, was assassinated, and Esarhaddon wanted to make sure that his chosen successor, Ashurbanipal, who wouldn't have the same sorts of difficulties becoming king that Esarhaddon himself did. And as part of that project, he had people throughout the empire swear their loyalty to his chosen successor before he even died. And part of that oath includes the following instruction, where it says, "You shall not help anyone from among his brothers, his uncles, his cousins, his family, or members of his father's line, whether those who are in Assyria or those who have fled to another land, or anyone in the closer palace groups or in the more remote palace groups, or any groups, great or small, or any of the old or young, of the rich or the poor, whether a bearded courtier or a eunuch, or one of the servants, or one of the bought slaves, or any Assyrian, or a subject of another land, or any human being at all, any one of you to seize the throne, nor shall you hand over to him the kingship and lordship of Assyria." What's interesting here is that we go essentially from people who have the closest claim to the throne, people who could make the most credible challenge to Ashurbanipal's succession, increasingly further and further and further. And the furthest, broadest category of people who can lay claim are the Assyrians before we get to people who are outside of Syria and not included at all. What this suggests is that the conception of Assyrianness that we see here is one of everybody who is a part of this kingdom, of this state, of this empire, is fundamentally an Assyrian, regardless of background, and it's only those who are outside of the kingdom who are not Assyrian. So if we ask again the question, who is part of civilization? The short answer is Assyrians, who are all those who are subject to Assyria's agrarian order. And the important takeaway is that we see that Assyrianness is not tied here to any ethno-national criteria, but simply to being a part of this society, this agrarian state system. So the counterpart of this question, what's civilization and who is part of civilization, is barbarism. So if we think about everything that exists beyond the state, we can start to tackle barbarism. So the world beyond the Assyrian Empire, of course, existed, and everybody who was not a part of the Assyrian system was technically outside of the empire. On one level, it's very straightforward to think who is not part of the empire. That's anybody who is a subject of another kingdom, whether that kingdom was later conquered or not. So people from the kingdom of Elam, or the kingdom of Babylon, or the kingdom of Egypt, or Judah, or Philistia, all of these people are recognized as not being Assyrian, and there are references to Elamites and Babylonians and Egyptians. And the way these people are described fundamentally is as an exact mirror of the Assyrian people. So just as the Assyrian people are all the people of the Assyrian kingdom, so too the Egyptians are all the people of the Egyptian kingdom. And these states, they operate essentially in the same mold. They are all agrarian states, and they have the same basic rules of play. But that's not the only people who exist outside of the empire. There are other groups that are not organized in the state method that also exist outside of the Assyrian Empire, which brings us back to this slide that I showed you earlier about the agrarian order and Hassan Kaif in particular. So one of the things that this picture shows us is this dense concentration of settlement, the city itself, with its agricultural lands beyond, where people farm and regularly go to tend the land, to harvest, and to engage in the various activities that are associated with agriculture. But within a clear, short walk of the city itself, you quickly come to land which is not suitable for farming. In this case, these higher mountains. So from the perspective of the state, the things that are interesting are obviously the city itself and its farmland. Those lands beyond are not so interesting because there's not much in terms of value that can be extracted from there. And the cost of exercising control over these lands is not worth it in general. So the people who are attached to the land, who live by the farmland, the state is interested in controlling. But once one of these people runs into the mountains, as much as they would like to get him back, it's very easy for this person to disappear. And this is a problem that we see again and again in Mesopotamian history. And it's a problem that isn't reflected when we look at a map. So here's another map of the Assyrian Empire at its height. And what we see is this big blob of pinkish, reddish color, and that represents Assyria. And we think in modern terms, so these are the borders of the state, and there's checkpoints. It's nothing like that at all. Essentially, the state and its servants are active in only small parts of this area that's colored in pink. That's those areas where there is intensive farming, where there are cities, and where people live. But as soon as you get away from these areas, there is no real state control. The soldiers of the state don't go through there. The state doesn't send any servants into those areas because it doesn't make any sense for them to do so. There's very little economic value to be extracted from there, and there's not much point in sending people there when whoever you might want to catch, whatever activities you might want to engage in, are prohibitively difficult because the people that live there can easily move away and hide from you, and it becomes very difficult to get anything at all done. So the actual control, if we wanted to draw a map reflecting that, would be much more narrow than something like this suggests, and really limited to those places where we have intense farmland, and not to those places where we have populations that are much freer, that roam around, that are mobile. And there were many such populations, mobile pastoralist populations, that are an endemic part of the landscape. These are people that subsist primarily on things like sheep herding. So periodically they will be in one area, but then they'll quickly move on. And if you try to chase them, they can move. They don't have to come back to a certain place. So unlike farmers who eventually will have to come back to their land, these people are free to escape the long arm of the state and are very well positioned to get out from under its grasp. So these sorts of people are functionally ungovernable. They don't exist within the state system, even if they are an essential complement to the state system. People who live in these intense zones of farmland will see the shepherds going through the mountains on a regular basis. They'll probably have intimate contacts with them, but these mobile peoples are not controlled by the state in the same way that the settled farmers are. And this is reflected not just in Mesopotamia, but pretty much everywhere in the sorts of ideas that these agrarian states have about mobile peoples, that they have no knowledge of lordship, they're insubmissive, they have backwards cultures, they eat raw meat, all these sorts of tropes we find in Mesopotamian sources as elsewhere to describe these sorts of people. If we look at a map of the Middle East, a satellite map, we quickly see just how much land there is that fits this description. That is land that is not suitable for intensive agricultural production, that is essentially waste in which the state will exercise very little to no control whatsoever. We can see Mesopotamia with the characteristic Tigris and Euphrates water systems, but in between and around them, there is essentially steppe land, unproductive steppe land, and then to the north and east, the Zagros and Taurus mountains, which are likewise difficult to access and similarly unproductive except for different sorts of people who practice different modes of subsistence. So state control will essentially be limited to this land along the rivers or fertile mountain valleys, or in some zones where you have enough rainfall, you can have places where intensive farming is practiced even in the absence of the big rivers, but this is quite limited in the Middle East. Sometimes the state will invest in maintaining control over corridors between areas. So for instance, in Assyria, there was a large corridor that connected the Tigris River system in the east with the Khabur River to the west. The Khabur is the one that feeds into the Euphrates. So although that path traverses unproductive steppe land, it was valuable enough that the Assyrian state built up a road with stations there and maintained control over that passage at least. And then occasionally, even though it was economically not viable, they would build fortresses and invest in maintaining control over strategic mountain passes or other bits and pieces of the landscape. But these decisions were made purely on a need basis and were very restricted. So most of the map would have been essentially free of state control. And then you ask, so who actually lives in these places that are free of state control? So we can think of isolated populations. That's a population that lives pretty far away from these major zones of intensive agriculture. So even if they can practice agriculture, they're far enough from the major zones that they escape the attention of the big states. We can think of places where there isn't enough scope for agricultural production, that there's very few people living there, in which case, again, the state will not find it worthwhile necessarily to extend its reach there. We can think of the sorts of mobile populations that we've talked about, so populations that don't have a fixed abode, but who move seasonally to different areas for grazing purposes or other reasons. And of course, we can think of bandits and outlaws. If you don't want to be a part of the state system, don't want to pay your taxes, don't want to participate in all of this sort of stuff, you can turn against the state and you can go to these remote places, whether it's the mountains or the steppe or the marshes of southern Iraq, hide and periodically make your way into the more productive zones to steal and plunder and have your way. And of course, there are people who, for other reasons, are fugitives from the state system who will sometimes flee into these zones. So all these sorts of populations are not integrated into the state system and are not a concrete part of the state system, even when they live very close to some of the major centers of this state system. So these sorts of populations, which we can think of as indigestible populations from the point of view of the state, that is, are very broadly attested throughout Mesopotamian history. There's a long history of struggle between these sorts of populations and the major agrarian states that characterize Mesopotamian civilization. So in the second millennium, there's references to the so-called sagas, who are these head smashers. At later periods, there are the Khabiru, Khabatu, all these sorts of robbers and bandits. Then there are people, mobile pastoralist people, similar to the Bedouin, like the Sutians, the Amorites, and the Ahlamu, who live largely by pastoralism. And then there are mountain peoples like Gutians, Kassites, Manians. So whenever these people appear in the sources, and they appear a lot, they're depicted as the quintessential barbarians. These are the people that live alongside the state system, but are not a part of it, and often are depicted as being really not just outside of the state system, but culturally also not a part of this system. They don't share the same values. They don't know how to worship God the way we do. They do things differently over there, and they are not like us. That's the big takeaway that we see in all of these descriptions. If we look at Assyria, Assyria is no exception in terms of its hostile attitude towards these sorts of people. So we see a lot of the same sorts of tropes about having no culture, no proper worship of God, none of these characteristics in descriptions of these sorts of populations. A typical one we can see in this inscription here, where there's a list of various Aramean groups on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris that are collectively labeled insubmissive Arameans who did not know fear of death, or who do not know fear of death. There's also references to insubmissive people of the mountains. So these are the two big categories, the people of the steppe, the mobile pastoralists, and the people of the mountains. But there's also plenty of references to other forms of outlaws, and essentially anybody who's outside of the system, regardless of their reason for being outside of the system, will be depicted as an outlaw on some level. It's not just the idea that that these people are different that bothers them. It's also the nature of the interaction with these people that the Assyrian state finds problematic. A lot of the interactions are violent and hostile, at least the ones that are recorded in our sources. One of the ways that we can see this is that from the Middle Assyrian period onward, royal inscriptions reflect that there were a very, very large number of military campaigns against various confederations of peoples in the mountains or mobile pastoralists. That is not against other states, but mostly against these sorts of scattered people that don't really have states of their own. It's also interesting that one of the only stories that we have from Assyria about somebody other than the king and his heroic exploits, this Naid Shichu epic so-called, is a story about a general who fights not, again, the great Babylonian enemy or the great Elamite enemy who conquers Egypt, but about a guy who chases essentially mobile pastoralists up the mountains to get them out of the Assyrian heartland to stop their plundering ways. We also see it in everyday texts. So there is a letter, SA 18148, in which somebody writes that the Arabs attacked the Assyrians, the king's servants who came to Birati to do business, and took away by force 50 Assyrians from Khalule, and with them 20 Biratians, servants of the king. So they had a lot of experience like this with different members of these groups outside of the state system, plundering and stealing and robbing. And we see this in many other texts. There's a lot of instances of sheep stealing, which makes sense from a pastoralist point of view. In one text, there's as many as 10,000 sheep that are reported to have been stolen by these sorts of people. So there's a lot of practical disharmony between the state and these people outside of the state that we see reflected in our sources. Which brings us to early Arameans. We'll look at the record of Arameans primarily through the cuneiform sources, that is through to the end of the Assyrian Empire in 612. So when we look at evidence of Arameans, the earliest textual references that we have to them come from cuneiform sources, that is, sources written in Akkadian from Mesopotamia. This is from about 1100 BCE onwards, where we have references to people that are called Kur Arumu-Mesh, Arameans fundamentally. The oldest reference to Aram, not Arameans, but to geographical Aram, though some people interpret this in a more people-oriented sense, but that's a discussion for a different day, comes from the Saphira inscriptions. That's the 8th century. That's substantially later than the earliest cuneiform inscriptions. And the reference there is to a place, Aram Kole, all of Aram. Exactly what that means, that's a different discussion. If we look at references to Arameans and the Aramaic evidence, we find that they are incredibly rare until we get to the period after the Assyrian Empire. As I mentioned, the earliest appearance of the term is in the Saphira inscriptions, where there's a reference to Aram Kule, all Aram, but there's also a reference to all of Upper and Lower Aram, again suggesting this geography of Lower Aram, which is the area of Damascus, and Upper Aram, which is more the area of Aleppo. There's also two inscriptions that refer to a state based in Damascus as Aram, which we also know from the text of the Bible. But outside of this, there is no reference to Arameans until we get to the, as I said, the post-Assyrian period. And there isn't any other major reference to Aram really at all. So if we look at this meager set of sources, we can say that there's an area of Syria that is geographically known as Aram. Exactly what that means for the people who are living there isn't clear. We simply don't have the sources. So what we will be talking about is more the view of Arameans as we get it from Assyria itself, rather than what might be happening in the West. And we also, as I mentioned, we have no clear use of the term Aram as an ethnonym whatsoever. So if we look instead at the cuneiform evidence, of which we have not only much earlier material, but a lot more material, we'll notice a few curious trends. One is that there are no individual Arameans. There's never a guy who's called the Aramean. There's never references to saying this man is an Aramean, anything like that, which suggests that to the extent that Arameans are a part of this landscape, it's not interesting for the most part, whether or not they are Aramean. It doesn't really mean anything when somebody meets another person, whether they're Aramean or not Aramean isn't something that comes up, at least not in a way that we see in our texts. When it comes to the more official record, we see that there are references to Arameans. The earliest ones refer not simply to Arameans, but to Ahlamu-Arameans. Ahlamu is a much older term that we find in Mesopotamian sources to refer to groups of people who are mobile pastoralists, essentially the very expression of the sorts of people we've been talking about that exist outside of the state system. So the fact that the Arameans are being called Ahlamu-Arameans ties them very closely to this sort of life, this sort of social organization. The cuneiform writing system also has a practice of categorizing people with the terms either Lu or Lutu or Kur. Lutu refers to a group of people. So when Arameans are qualified as being Lutu, it suggests that they are a group of people, not a state like Egypt or Babylon or Aram or anything like that. And when they are indexed or qualified with the word Kur, it suggests that they do have a land. But what's very interesting here is that Arameans are called Kur Arameans regardless of where they are. So they're called this not only when we find them in the place that we know as Aram, that is modern Syria, but also when we find them all over the Middle East, whether it's in Babylon or close to what is today Iran. In all of these places, they're called Kur Arameans. And we can't imagine that all of these places are the land of Aram. There's no such conception. So clearly, the Kur here isn't working as a designation for a fixed territory, but more for a collection of Arameans in some capacity. If we look at descriptions of Arameans, we'll see that they are organized according to cuneiform sources, very much on a tribal model, which again aligns with the idea that they are these mobile pastoralists. So we see this is the longest list of Aramean groups that we have from the cuneiform sources. There's more than 30 of them. So there's a whole range of them. And the conclusion is all of the Arameans on the banks of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Suraku rivers, as far as the Upnu River, which is by the shore of the Lower Sea. I annexed to Assyria the Arameans, as many as there were, and I placed a eunuch of mine as provincial governor over them. This statement is more aspirational than functional, because a lot of these areas are not effectively under Assyrian control, not only at the time that this inscription is written, but also subsequently we see that they slip in and out of Assyrian state control. But the conception that we see of Arameans here is very much as a group that, as a body of people that is tribally organized. And what's interesting is that when we encounter lists of Arameans, sometimes they will have many of these groups listed, sometimes they will only have one or two or three, and sometimes they'll dispense with the listing of individual tribal names and just say the Arameans and get it done with. When we think geographically, where do we find these Arameans? I've already suggested that they are not located simply in Aram, that is modern Syria, but elsewhere. If we look at the oldest references from Tiglath-Pileser I, we see a description that does match nicely with Aram Assyria. That is, there's this reference to Ahlamu-Arameans from the edge of the land Suhu, that's the middle Euphrates area to the city of Carchemish, that's on the border between Syria and Turkey today, Turkish side on the Euphrates. There's another one where he says, I've crossed the Euphrates 28 times, twice in 1 year in pursuit of the Ahlamu-Arameans. I brought about their defeat from the city Tadmor, that's Palmyra, of the land Amuru, Anat of the land Suhu, again the middle Euphrates, as far as the city Rapiku of Karduniash, which is in the area where the Euphrates and the Tigris come close together in the middle of Iraq. There's also a chronicle fragment that suggests that there were Arameans invading the Assyrian heartland in this period. And if we map all of this, it looks something like this. So there are Arameans from Carchemish to Suhu and from Tadmor to Rapiku, with the incursion from this area to the Assyrian heartland represented by this arrow. So this model works with the idea that Arameans are coming from the desert, which is the older model, where there seems to be this kind of invasion. There's a series of peoples coming out of the desert, first the Amorites, then the Arameans, later the Arabs. But that isn't actually the view that we get when we look a little bit more closely, because in the inscriptions just after Tekalpileser I, and indeed over the next few hundred years, we find the distribution of Arameans to be quite dramatically different. So Ashurbanipal Kala refers to Arameans throughout the Tur Abdin region and the city Dur Katlimu on the Khabur, to Arameans who are on the shore of the Sea of the Setting Sun, that's the Mediterranean, and to Arameans on the banks of the Tigris and Suraku rivers, as far as the Ukno River, which is by the shore of the Lower Sea, that is the Persian or Arabian Gulf. You can choose your preferred name for that body of water. And there are also various groups spread throughout the geographical area of Babylonia that are referred to as Aramean. If we map that, we get a radically different distribution. So all of these purple circles are major areas of Aramean presence according to the Assyrian inscriptions, with some sites outside of these circles as well, where we find reports of Arameans. Essentially, if we think of this map a little bit more broadly, this is a map that overlaps pretty much fully, with the exception of the southern Levant, with the map of the Assyrian Empire. So wherever Assyria goes, it finds Arameans, lots and lots of Arameans. This is not a view that's consistent with the idea that there's a concentration of Arameans somewhere in Syria, and then they're emerging from there and from the desert to conquer or settle throughout the great productive Euphrates-Tigris river system. But this suggests instead that there is something else happening here, and what that might be, we'll get to in a second. But first, the big area that we think of when we think of Aram based on Aramaic texts is this red circle over here. And we see that it doesn't overlap very well at all with the zone of Aramean occupation as described in the cuneiform sources. So there's this mismatch between the area where we see Aramaic written material in the first half of the first millennium BCE and the area where we see references to Arameans, which in a talk that I hope to give for the foundation in March, I will talk about at greater length about this disconnect between language and people. But for now, the focus is on how we get so many Arameans throughout all of the areas where Assyria extends its reach. And there, it helps if we step away from thinking of Arameans as a fixed ethnic group or as a group strictly tied to the area, the geographical area of Aram, but instead as a broad term, a broad category that the Assyrian sources use to describe people outside of the state system. This helps explain how it is that all of a sudden we get quite so many Arameans throughout this whole area. So it's not that there's an invasion of people, but for some reason, the Assyrians are using a different term, a different category to refer to these people, and that happens to be Arameans. And it also helps us to explain for the fact that Arameans are clearly not associated exclusively with any state or region in our material. When we look at what Arameans are up to according to the sources that we have, it also aligns very nicely with the sorts of activities that we would expect for pastoralist peoples outside of the state system. One of the things that we see them doing is making trouble. Here we have an 11th century inscription of a Babylonian king, where it records that during the reign of Adad Apla Idina, king of Babylon, hostile Arameans and Sutians are another famous mobile pastoralist group, enemies of Ekur and Nippur, who desecrated Duranki and disturbed the cultic rites of Separ, the ancient city, abode of the great judge of the gods. They plundered the land of Sumer and Akkad, and they overthrew all the temples. We can also see that they are associated with all of the least favored sorts of people, categories of people from the point of view of Assyria. So this is an inscription of Sennacherib's. On my 8th campaign, after Shuzabu had rebelled and the citizens of Babylon, evil Galu demons had locked the city gates, they plotted to wage war. Arameans, runaways, fugitives, shedders of blood, robbers, rallied around Shuzabu, a Chaldean, a base person, a coward, a servant subordinate to the governor of Lachiru. They went down into the marshes and fomented rebellion. So again, we see this association of Arameans very strongly in this case with all of these categories of people that exist outside of the state system that are not part of the Assyrian order. This is perhaps most vividly expressed in this inscription, the so-called Nimrud Prism from the reign of Sargon, in which the following is described. The land had long since been waste. In its interior, the way was cut off, the road was exceedingly difficult, and no paths had been made. Thorn, thistle, and bush overwhelmed the inaccessible trails, so that dogs and jackals took refuge in them and gambled about like lambs. In that wasteland, Arameans and Sutians, tent dwellers, fugitives, criminals, a gang of bandits, had pitched their dwellings, and they prevented passage across it. There were settlements among them that had long ago lapsed into ruin. There was no irrigation channel or furrow over their arable land. It was instead woven over with spiders' webs. Their fertile meadows had become like a wilderness. Their arable lands were bereft of the sweet harvest song. Grain was cut off. The bush I cut down, the thorn and thistle I burned with fire. The Arameans, that gang of bandits, I felled with weapons. As for the lions and wolves, I brought about their defeat. So the nice thing about this passage is that it perfectly juxtaposes all the things that are associated with Arameans and Sutians, that is, this existence outside of the state framework, where they let the land lie fallow, they don't farm, they let all of the settlements go to waste, they don't take care of the irrigation, they represent fundamentally everything that's outside of the agrarian system. And what does Sargon do? What's his mission as the Assyrian king? He comes in there, he chases away all of these non-agricultural peoples, and instead brings back farming and civilization and the agrarian order to this land that was outside of it but was suitable for it. So this is precisely the opposition between Arameans and Assyrians that we see in the sources, these Assyrian sources. So if we look at the record of Arameans through these sources, we see that Arameans are defined primarily by the fact that they exist outside of the state and that they practice economic modes of subsistence that are not amenable to control by the state. That is primarily mobile pastoralism. And of course, their existence beyond the state associates them in the imagination of the state with practices like banditry and other undesirable activities. As we saw in the previous passage, there's the strong juxtaposition between civilization, which is the agrarian order, and barbarism, which is ascribed to all of the people beyond, and especially the people that are not part of any agrarian order. So we don't find these terms of derision applied to, say, Egyptians, because they have their own agrarian order, even if it's outside of Assyrian control. Arameans in these sources, they are the barbarians par excellence. That is, they function as this foil to the Assyrian order, and they are represented ideologically as the other, the fundamental other. All of this, however, is misleading on one level, and that's that this entire record is what we see when we read the Assyrian sources, which come from a very particular ideological point of view. That is the point of view of the agrarian state and agrarian civilization, which rejects, for obvious reasons, everything that exists outside of it as being somehow undesirable, fundamentally because it can't be brought effectively under control. But there is a whole world that exists outside of this ideological representation that shows that things were not an unremitting catalogue of battles between people who were mobile pastoralists and people that were farmers. Most of the time, these people were not fighting at all. But of course, when people are not fighting and getting along, this is not something that you write about in royal inscriptions. This is not interesting. This is not newsworthy. Bad news is the sort of stuff that you write about, not things that are everyday and ordinary and uneventful. So when we look at sources, we see that there was a whole other way of being together that predominated most of the time, even if it isn't described directly. So one of the things that we see, for instance, is that there were two Aramean groups in particular, the Ituians and the Gurians, that were incorporated into the Assyrian army. So there are these whole tribes that, although they maintain an independent existence, an autonomous existence outside of the Assyrian state, they do provide soldiers for the Assyrian state, very particular kind of soldiers. They're mobile troubleshooters that are sent on urgent business to suppress local rebellions, local unrest. So these are allies of the Assyrian state, even though they continue to exist outside of the Assyrian state. There's also the fact that economically, this whole pastoral system is a perfect complement to the agrarian order. So the surpluses that are generated by a mobile pastoralist economy, that is wool and other byproducts of animals that are raised, are things that are very desirable from the point of view of farmers, because they don't produce quite so much of it themselves, whereas the things that farmers produce are essential to mobile pastoralists. They simply can't exist without each other. Most of the time, they would have come together at fairs and at certain times and places to exchange their goods, and they would have done so peacefully and without any difficulty whatsoever. This would have been the dominant mode of interaction between these two different groups of people. Another thing that we see, as we did with other groups, is that there's nothing fundamentally different about Arameans in the end. As people, as individuals, Arameans can become Assyrian just like anybody else. And we see indeed that many groups of Arameans at different times are captured by Assyrian armies and resettled in Assyria, in the Assyrian heartland and in other places, and integrated into the agrarian order. Once that happens, there's nothing fundamentally Aramean about them anymore, and they become just as Assyrian as anybody else. And this happens, for instance, to tens of thousands of Aramean deportees in the record of Tiglath-Pileser III. So most of the time, despite the immense hostility, ideological hostility that we see in our sources, relations between Assyrians and these mobile pastoralist Arameans will have been peaceable, will have been mutually beneficial, and uneventful, really, in a good sense of that term. If we sum up and we think of insiders and outsiders, civilization and barbarism, these are dichotomies that arise from the way that the Assyrian state was organized. So organized around agriculture, and as such, everybody within that system was an insider and included in what they viewed as civilization, and those that existed outside of it, ideologically at least, were portrayed as the barbaric other, not part of the system because they were not able to be included in the system. Sometimes Assyrians made efforts to incorporate these tribes, but they had no enduring success. So to conclude, whoever is part of the Assyrian agrarian order is fundamentally Assyrian. Assyrians are all those people who are part of the state system, who farm it, who are craftsmen within it, who serve the state. And because this viewpoint defines Arameans by their existence outside of the state, we see this overwhelming ideological hostility, but this hostility is related exclusively to the fact that they maintain an existence independent of the state and uncontrollable by the state. It has nothing to do with who they are as individuals, nothing to do with any language that they might speak. And indeed, over time, this Aramean category is used to describe basically all mobile pastoralist peoples. It becomes a quick reference for all these people outside of the state, in the same way that at different points in time, terms like Sutian and Ahlamu-Aramean function in other cuneiform sources. Important to stress that Arameans are not a coherent group in these sources. We find them throughout the Middle East. They appear under various different tribal labels. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they work against each other. There is no clear uniting characteristic beyond this existence outside of the state. And as I mentioned, there's nothing innate, immutable about being an Aramean. It's simply related to the relationship between Arameans and the state system. When people start to live more like Arameans, they can blend into this Aramean category, and vice versa. Once Aramean groups are integrated into the agrarian order, they stop being Aramean. And with that, I would just like to thank you very much for having invited me, and I shall end the talk. Thank you again.